Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mary Sarah Bilder, Michael Klarman, Jeffrey Rosen, and moderator Doug Bradburn.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jeff. Well, good morning. Constitutional principles and ideas for 100, Alex. What is a constitution? Mary Bilder, you start.
Yeah, this is something I find I spend a lot of time with my students talking about, is the fact that our Constitution, our notion of a Constitution was kind of a new genre, right? It was a new idea that you could have a piece of paper and you could write down on that piece of paper the frame of government. And in the period that the framers were working with in 1787, that idea was in transition. So people had begun to write down on pieces of paper charters. There were examples in England, there were state constitutions, what they wanted a frame of government to be, what rights they wanted. But no one yet had really begun to think that was the Constitution. And so in this period, we see people talking about the instrument, the piece of paper, and the Constitution as the body of government. And over time, particularly after ratification, after the new government set up, after the Supreme Court starts interpreting what the Constitution means, those two concepts, the piece of paper on which the words are written and the frame of government, the way government operates, begin to merge. And so today I think we think of it as the Constitution, a merged concept. But in the period we're talking about, they're still working that out.
Michael Klarman, what would you add to that?
Even a system that doesn't think it has a constitution has to have a kind of unwritten constitution. There has to be some set of ground rules that allow you to recognize when, for example, a law has been passed. Even Great Britain, that doesn't have a written constitution, the society has to have an understanding that a law requires passage by both houses of parliament and it can be vetoed by the king. So even if you don't have a written constitution, there has to be a kind of pre-constitution that gives you the basic rules of the road.
And Jeffrey, what would you add at the Constitution Center? When people walk in there, do they know what a constitution is? What is it?
So constituere is the Latin. Con, with, and statuere, establish, or reform, or stand. In some sense, it means come together or stand together. And as Mike says, a framework for deliberation, the rules of the road, a mechanism for resolving differences. And that's why, for Madison, the central idea of providing a structure for people to deliberate thoughtfully, to compromise, to slow down deliberations so that reason rather than passion could provide. The Constitution doesn't provide the answers, but it provides a structure for bringing all sides together for reasoned deliberation.
So what is experimental about the American experiment? What do you think? Let's start with Jeff. We'll do the snake and go back the other way. Jeffrey.
Hamilton says it in Federalist 1, which was passed or published just last week, October 27th, 1787. He says it's a test of the proposition whether men can be ruled by reason and conviction, not force or violence. It's a test of the Enlightenment proposition that people can set aside their unreasonable passions and be guided by reason. And the reason it's an experiment is because no one's sure whether or not it's going to work. And all of the framers, Washington and Hamilton and Madison, are all unsure, especially at the end of their lives, about whether people can find enough virtue, enough self-mastery, enough self-restraint, enough ability to set aside their selfish passions and serve the common interest for the experiment to survive. Madison is the most hopeful because he expects the least of government. Washington at the end is despairing because he sees faction. He thinks people won't survive. Jefferson thinks the Union's going to split apart. But they all hope.
Mary, what's experimental about the founding?
I love the letter you quoted because you cut out a word in that quote, which is Washington writes to Catherine Macaulay, the last great experiment. And I was like, well, we don't want to say the last, so we'll cut it down to great experiment. And I think last there he doesn't mean the last one, although in some ways it turns out to be that one, but in a long line of failed experiments. And what he was talking about was what at the time was a pretty radical idea, trying to have a country ruled where sovereignty didn't lie in the king. And that's much more radical than we understand. And this really came true when I was watching, like many Americans, that sort of weird, like, I'll just turn the coronation on for a few moments, because it does look kind of cool, even though I know, like, right, like we had nothing, that's what we rebelled against, but it's kind of awesome. But that really struck me how hard it is to give up monarchy in that kind of subject sovereignty faith that came with monarchy. And so I think what Washington was talking about was, could you bond a group of people together in what he calls, sort of a reasonable civil compact without the kinds of traditional allegiances to sovereignty that had been associated with monarchy? And could you, monarchy allows you to have a lot of division, and at the end of the day, everybody's a subject. But could you come up with a political system where you could manage that type of division, that type of diversity of opinion, different kinds of people over a very large space, and have that succeed? And was there a way to do that? And I really think the great experiment, writ very large, was that notion of moving sovereignty from the king to the people. And their whole entire understanding of that was those experiments failed. They collapsed. People became corrupt. They had very complicated theories of which group of people were going to become corrupt. Was it the people at the top or the people at the bottom? But I actually think that's the most amazing thing about it, was they somehow, after many experiments over centuries, somehow got some balance right long enough to actually not only make that successful, right, but after that, the American Revolution does represent a gradual global shift away from a type of sovereign monarchy.
Two big answers. Michael, what is experimental in the Constitution as ratified?
A lot of it's experimental, but I think I would identify three key moves that they made. So one is popular sovereignty, which Mary just explained. The people are going to express an opinion about whether this Constitution that's been written in Philadelphia will be approved or not. Federalism is a big experiment, so they've shifted a great deal of power from the state level to the national level, but they're still expecting that most governance will be done at the state level. There'll be some obvious conflicts. The Supremacy Clause makes it clear if there's a conflict, the federal rule will triumph over the state rule, but that's a big shift in governance, the idea that you're going to split power between the states and the federal government. And finally, I think the presidency is a very novel conception. So most of the framers wanted to move away from the state constitutions, which had pretty much eviscerated the executive. Governors had very little power. They were selected by state legislatures. They usually had one-year terms in office. They wanted to create a much more powerful executive, but they didn't want to create a king. So they were arriving at some interim point in the spectrum between an eviscerated executive and a monarch. And that was, I think, entirely experimental.
So our session is called Principles and Ideas. Where are some of the ideas coming from that's driving these experiments? Are they from experience itself in colonial governance, or are they more philosophic? Are they coming from books and visionary things? Or, what is the first thing that comes to your mind when you think about where are the ideas for the Constitution coming from? We'll start with Jeff again.
They're coming from books and experience, but what's remarkable is how they read so many of the same books. I, over COVID, set out to read the books on Thomas Jefferson's reading list that he would send to kids who were going to law school that he thought encapsulated the core meaning of happiness. And
isn't that what everybody did during COVID? Obviously, Jeff, that's what we did.
We couldn't go outside, it was tough. It was, we were all quarantined and you had to do something. It was just, I was moved to do it, and it's just amazing. First, what I found is that all the books on his list, and these are classic moral philosophers like Seneca, Epictetus, and Aurelius, as well as Enlightenment philosophers, Locke, Burlamaqui, the Scottish folks, Hutcheson. These books all contain the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, and all of them define happiness not as feeling good, but being good, not as seeking pleasure, but virtue, self-mastery, being your best self, character improvement, aligning with the eternal truths of the Declaration. And it's just really striking how all of the founders had the same conception of happiness. Franklin had it with his 13 virtues, and Adams and Madison in their drafts of the Declaration. And they saw a connection between private and public happiness, just as individuals had to use their powers of reason to achieve calm self-mastery, so government should be structured to achieve the same harmony in the constitution of the state that people are supposed to achieve in their own mind. And what is so striking is that the Federalist Papers, when read through that lens, is a manual for public happiness. And suddenly we see that the Enlightenment philosophers, they're reading to structure governments, like Montesquieu on the separation of powers, obviously Locke on the social contract. Those are the four thinkers that Jefferson identifies as the source of the revolution: Locke, Aristotle, Sidney, and Cicero. All of them are saying that we've got to structure governments in order to prevent people from being ruled by passion, to ensure reason, and to ensure that virtue prevails. What's just remarkable is what a kind of core curriculum there were. And their readings also identified the differences in their political philosophies. Hamilton is a big Hume guy, and Hume is the conservative who exalts the British Constitution. Jefferson is a Whig who reads Cato's letters and sees Hume as sort of honeyed Toryism. So his conception of states' rights and limited power is derived from the Whigs, and Hamilton with his nationalism from Hume. But what all of these people share, both the Enlightenment and the classic folks, is a devotion to what we would call now the liberal idea. Limited government, the need for individual self-mastery, the core of virtue, and it all comes from their readings. It is really exciting to see the American mind being distilled in this remarkable period of the 1760s and 70s from these kids who all went to college around the same time. Some were self-taught, some went to the great universities, but they're reading their books and they're distilling the essence of American constitutionalism.
That's fascinating, and you have a book coming out on this subject this year, so that's your preview. When Jeff first told me about this, I think we were in Williamsburg at the time, I was blown away and very excited, and I look forward to seeing that book. I will say my sourdough starter is pretty good too, that I did during COVID. I think it's still going strong, so it would be nice to ask everybody what they did during COVID, but
I apologize.
No. Thank you. Thank you. Absolutely. So Mary Bilder, what are the ideas? What are the things you think of first when people ask you, like, where do the ideas of the Constitutional Convention come from?
Yeah, I just have to say, I teach that letter to I would teach an American legal history for a lawyer's class to my law students, and we read that letter.
Jefferson's letter.
Yeah, Jefferson's letter, and I'm like, would you prefer to be a law student now or then? And Jefferson has this part in that letter that says, like, you know, when it's summer, it's really great because you can read longer on both sides. And my students universally are like, yeah, I wouldn't have wanted to live in Jefferson's time. So I'm very impressed by Jeff. You know, I think Jeff's point is excellent. I think what he says, I'm really looking forward to that book. One of the things that this whole generation of people worried about, and it extends way beyond just the people who are in the room, was a sense that ambition was corrupting, that power corrupted. They were trained in a way to worry about that. And so they worried a lot about how did you restrain individual people from becoming corrupt, from making the wrong decisions, from starting out thinking that they had a good goal and then somehow being twisted. So I agree with that. I think another set of their ideas, just to add something to the conversation, very much come from their experience beginning in arguably back in 1765 with the Stamp Act Congress, but then in 1774 with the first Congress, and the effort they had, experience they learned in that over a decade period of trying to run a country that was surrounded by large European countries that would have been completely happy to move back in, and the kinds of ways that their initial attempt at that, the Articles of Confederation, sort of what they could politically get done there, was insufficient. And so I think of the 1787 Constitution in a lot of ways as a second constitution, as a second attempt at trying to understand. And one of the things that they did, Michael just referred to this, is they shifted power in a much more nationalistic way. And people like Washington and Madison, Hamilton and others come to Philadelphia with even a more aggressive, robust version of national power. Madison spent the entire convention and left the convention disappointed that Congress was not given the power to veto state laws. And so the principles, the sort of working idea they had was very much a response to what they saw were the failures, particularly national defense failures under the Articles of Confederation.
Professor Klarman, how would you treat this question in your opening to your con law class?
So they certainly were classically educated. They read a lot of books, but I think a lot of their ideas were refracted through both experience and interest. And since we haven't said anything about interest, let me just start with that. So the biggest fight in the Philadelphia Convention, the one that almost ended the convention, was whether in one house of the national government you would apportion representation based on population or based on each state having the same equal representation. And they argued about that for 5 or 6 weeks. And the small state representative said, if we don't have equality in one branch of the national government, we're going home. And the large state delegate said, no, of course it should be, we're representing people, so every state should have representation apportioned according to population. And then they made theoretical arguments to justify those positions. So the small staters said, look, we're going to be discriminated against. The 3 large states, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Virginia, will gang up on us. And then Madison responded, but the 3 large states don't have anything in common. They come from different parts of the Union. They have different economic interests. They have different religious traditions. So they made theoretical arguments, but at the end of the day, this was a dispute about power. And the same thing was true, for example, about the southern states and the northern states. The South Carolina delegate said, we need to have our enslaved people count the same for apportionment purposes as anybody else. And the Massachusetts delegate said, that's absurd. You treat your slaves as if they're property, not people. They should count for nothing in apportionment. And they ended up making a compromise. But it was an argument about interest. With regard to experience, the one thing Mary talked about this, but I would emphasize a different experience. Something that was really fundamental to their deliberations was what to do about the populist economic relief legislation that a majority of states had passed. And in the one state that clearly had not passed it, Massachusetts, they just had a rebellion, Shays' Rebellion, where the debtor farmers had tried to shut down the civil courts because they were going to go bankrupt if they had to pay higher taxes without some sort of monetary and fiscal relief. That was a huge experience that led them in Philadelphia to debate about how to create a national government that could both prevent the states from passing debtor relief laws and paper money laws, but also how to insulate the federal government from direct populist influence. And the way to do that was to have long terms in office, indirect elections, and very large constituencies. And then they came up with fancy theoretical arguments for why you would get better government from a distant federal government than from state governments, but it was something very concrete that led them to espouse those ideas.
Fascinating. Yeah, these 3 answers are incredible because you got interest, experience, and ideas and, all at one, and that's what's going on there, and that's why you get so many people arguing over the Constitution and what it means going forward. 2 things I want to cover. There's so many things to talk about. I want to talk about the ratification process. My understanding is the Articles of Confederation agreed, well, these guys are going to meet in Philadelphia and maybe make some suggested amendments to the Articles. And they basically have an illegal, secret meeting of influential men that basically say, we're not doing that, we're going to write a whole new government and you guys are going to take it. And so how does it go? Tell me what really happened. How does the country go from this illegal meeting in Philadelphia to saying, we love this, we're gonna do this. We're gonna throw out the Articles of Confederation. It said that you had to have unanimity to amend it, but forget that. We're gonna create a whole new process and create a new government. So tell me what the real story is.
This is the great insight of constitution making, in particular that forgotten framer James Wilson. James Wilson from Pennsylvania, brilliant law professor at the University of Pennsylvania, becomes a Supreme Court justice, and tragically he gambles, his debts go bad, and he dies being pursued by his creditor, Pierce Butler, the biggest slaveholder, and dies of disease in a boarding house, broke and disgraced. But what he did is come up with the idea that we, the people of the United States as a whole, have the sovereign power, not the king and not the states as states. And that shift in sovereignty gives a theory of popular ratification. So it's okay that the Constitution is illegal according to the Articles. The Articles say you need unanimous consent, and as you say, they broke that rule in allowing for a smaller percentage of the states to ratify. But the reason is because the states call special conventions representing the people themselves. And because there's a special election procedure and because the deliberation is thoughtful and about first principles and not about immediate legislative interest, the Constitution as ratified has a special legal status which is higher than that of an ordinary law. And that idea that conventions are kind of I'm thinking of the fancy word mimetic, which wasn't one they used, but kind of actual representations of the people themselves, unlike our temporary representatives and servants, as they would consider legislators, is the big idea. And Wilson makes this case in defending ratification as an expression of popular will, and that was his and arguably the U.S.'s greatest contribution to constitutional thinking.
Yeah, the process of ratifying. Well, Michael Klarman, what would you add to the ratification story?
So the delegates in Philadelphia had a lot of chutzpah, as my Yiddish-speaking ancestors would say. They created a new system and they created a new set of rules to implement it. As Doug said, the Articles of Confederation were very clear. If you want to amend the Articles, you need to get unanimous consent by the state legislatures, and the framers understood there was zero chance they could get unanimous consent for what they were doing. If nothing else, Rhode Island had refused to send delegates, and they knew pretty clearly that New York as well would be opposed to what they were doing in Philadelphia. 2/3 of the New York delegation had gone home from Philadelphia because they were so unhappy with the nationalizing and anti-populist tenor of the convention. So they changed the rules. Article 7 says 9 states can put the Constitution into operation through special ratifying conventions, and then the other 4 states are free to go along or not, but there will be a new union with a new Constitution once 9 states ratify. And it turns out once 9 states have ratified, the remaining 4 states are under tremendous pressure to join the union because they are a foreign country. They will be discriminated against in their trade. They will not be protected by the federal military, and they will be cut out of all the important decisions being made by the first Congress, such as where to put the capital or whether to introduce a Bill of Rights. So by shifting the rule of decision to 9 rather than 13, they've managed to create a much greater chance the Constitution will be approved. And that turns out to be critically important because among the last states to approve were at least 3 that would have either rejected ratification or insisted on antecedent amendments had they gone earlier in the process. So by the time you get to Virginia and New York, which both meet beginning in June of 1788, they are on the verge of the 9th state, New Hampshire, ratifying. So Virginia and New York are now considering a completely different question, which is not whether you like the Constitution, whether you like it better than the Articles, but whether you want to be part of this new nation, which is going to exist whether you join it or not. And at the New York Convention, Hamilton actually financed from his own pocket fast riders to come from Richmond, Virginia, and from New Hampshire to report news that those states had ratified. So by the time New York is finally decided late in July, 11 states have already approved, and 11 states, 10 states have already approved. And so the question New York has to decide is, are we going to join this union? And there's a lot of pressure because New York City at that point is the capital, and everybody in New York City, 19 out of 20 people in New York voted in favor of delegates who would support the Constitution. New York's going to lose the capital, and New York City is threatening to secede from New York State if New York State doesn't ratify. So the framers were quite brilliant about that. Can I add something, or would you rather I just quit?
Yeah, that's good. I want Mary to add something. Mary, what would you add to this? This political chicanery, brilliance.
What I love about this period is everything's true at the same time. Like there's multiple truths. There's sort of the brilliance of how you think about ratification as a theoretical point. There's the political strategizing that's even crazier than anything you'd see today. New Hampshire's like, wait, we might lose, we're adjourning, come back later when we can manipulate the right people into showing up. But I think there's another through line that really matters, which is they cannot see the future. They do not understand what's going to happen. They leave Philadelphia unsure that they're going to have enough votes. They're not certain about it. They've sort of, unless I don't use the word illegal because that implies there's a structure where you know how constitutions are supposed, that there's an operating system. So they tried to meet in Annapolis. That had failed. One of the things that comes out of the Annapolis Convention is, I think, a quite brilliant move by Hamilton to say, let's go to Congress and ask Congress to make a convention call, to give it some legitimacy. So Congress actually does a convention call to render the federal Constitution sufficient. And the Philadelphia Convention comes out of that congressional call. And then a part of the story that people tend to skip over, but I think is really interesting, is the minute the convention breaks, they race to New York, to Congress. Everybody who's also a congressional member races up there. And because the convention technically imagines itself as reporting back to Congress. And they get to Congress, and in Congress, particularly the people who will become the Virginia opponents, try and get the entire Constitution redebated, line by line, like it was just a report. And Madison and other people who were in Philadelphia sink that. They sink that effort. The whole thing goes down differently if Congress redebates the whole thing. They sink that effort. And then they move to omit the fact that they had that vote from the record. And Madison, so now there's no evidence that there was even an attempt to redebate it. And Madison writes to Washington, this is what went down in Congress. And Washington writes him back, that's pretty good. People rarely peek behind the curtain. And I do think there's this way in which the fact that then Congress is the entity that technically sends the Constitution out changes the way that ratification feels to a lot of people. I have to say, Mike's point about Rhode Island, like New York and Virginia, I think if New York and Virginia hadn't ratified, it doesn't matter that 9 other states ratify. The whole thing goes down. So I think the 10th and 11th matter. Rhode Island was like, hey, we're whatever. And this is the part that's super coercive. They refuse to ratify. It's very divided in Rhode Island. And the federal government basically says, we're going to blockade you. And so they're like, okay, fine. We give up. It matters to us that we do this. But so there's both a sort of, sort of one side of it, and then there's also a coercive piece going on at the same time.
Yeah, that's really brilliant. All right, this will be quick though, and this goes the question. The winner gets their own question. The Annapolis Convention was mentioned. Where did the idea to have the Annapolis Convention come from?
Well, I know this, but
Well, then jump in. Then you get your own
yeah, but
question.
I don't know if this is the answer you're looking
Well,
for.
I'm looking for the right answer.
Yeah. Let's see. I think it's Washington.
Yes.
And in 1785, a trade, a smaller conference that's held at, I think, Mount Vernon.
Yes, the Mount
I can always
Vernon,
tell
the Mount
this.
Vernon Convention, the Mount Vernon Compact.
Yeah. If you come
Potomac
here,
Navigation Company.
right. If you come here often enough, you know when there's a certain light in Doug's eyes. The answer has to be George Washington or Mount Vernon. And then you have to work your way backwards to what the explanation would be.
So the Mount Vernon Compact, of course, was an agreement between Maryland and Virginia about how to do the commercial rights to the Potomac River. That was necessary because of the Potomac Navigation Company's charter, the first company chartered in multiple states, and George Washington was the first president of the first company chartered, and that happened right here at Mount Vernon because they were supposed to meet in Alexandria, but George Washington, in his wily way, manipulated them into meeting at Mount Vernon itself, and that's the peek behind the curtain there. But good. So, excellent. 100 points for Mary Bilder, and here is the question for you. So, Mary Bilder, what is the deal with
Why don't I get the last question?
What is the deal with Madison's notes?
Oh, yeah. So I wrote.
How do we know what's going on?
Yeah, I wrote a book about this. It's not the book that's out there. My more fun book to read, Female Genius, is out there. But most of what we know about the convention comes from Madison's notes. There were many people who took notes, but his notes are the only notes that cover every day, and they cover it like a little play. And even people who know that they're reading through Madison's eyes, you can't help it. You just end up telling the story the way he told it. But it's written from Madison's perspective. It's written with the people he liked playing a role and the people he didn't like not playing a role, and probably the people he really didn't like never appearing. So, like there's guys who never say anything, and they probably were unlikely to have been silent for 4 months. But, like they're gone. But one of the things that that has become clear in part because of the capacity to do digital and forensic research is that late in the convention, when the convention moved very importantly to committees, Madison stopped taking notes. And then only 2 years later did he go back with a journal he had borrowed, the official journal of the convention. He borrowed it from Washington, made a copy, and he then used that to end the notes to the end, to write the last 3 weeks. And what's important about that is that that section of the convention is when most of the things we care about today come into the Constitution. So the part that is sort of original and contemporaneously written up from rough notes he took involve big debates, like Michael was saying, the debates that give us about federalism, some of the debates on slavery, lots of things that we think matter, the Electoral College, presidential powers, the General Welfare Clause, that all comes in at a point where the notes are themselves unreliable. And where, interestingly, Madison writing several years later, after he's in Congress, after they've begun to add amendments, after they've had big fights about what the text of the Constitution means, that part of the notes, Madison has now become more interested in what the words mean.
Thank you.
And you can buy my book for a longer version of that.
That is what the deal is with Madison's notes. It's fascinating because, I mean, your book really exposed the kind of character of those notes in a really powerful way, I think, and how they were edited later and all that. So, wonderful stuff. Let's. I have a couple questions here from the audience. Well, first, here's a good one here from Rick Waddell. Have any other countries tried to copy our Constitution and replicate the success of our great experiment? What's the impact? Jeff?
So Norway is the closest friend of the Constitution. They had Madison's draft before them, and they're storing. Parliament passed a constitution in 1817 or so that's among the longest living Western constitutions. And what's especially significant about Norway is it's an outlier in following the American model. Most European constitutions in the 19th and 20th century follow a British parliamentary model or one that has a prime minister like Germany and France, but not separated powers. In Britain, the king in parliament is completely sovereign. The American separation of powers model is different. Perhaps the countries that have most adopted the American model, surprisingly, are Eastern European dictatorships. So the Russian constitution is beautiful and has all these gorgeous bills of rights and provisions that were drafted by American law professors who went over during the Yeltsin era and put those provisions into the Russian constitution. But it's not worth the paper that it's printed on because Putin is a dictator. He has no separation of powers. He has all the power. He can murder people and start wars without constraints by an independent judiciary or a separate Congress. So it's a very strong reminder of the fact that, and this was, all the framers took this point from reason and experience. It's not paper parchment guarantees, as they talked about a Bill of Rights. It's not the words on the paper. It's the structures of government. And in the end, separation of powers and an independent judiciary are far more important than the form of a constitution in guaranteeing liberty.
Yeah, but that's a really powerful reminder about what the meaning of the rule of law is versus the rule of man. Let's talk about our Bill of Rights. It isn't really a Declaration of Rights, which was certainly an option they could have gone with. Why are our Bill of Rights just a bunch of amendments that aren't even added in the proper places? They're just sort of slapped on in the back. Michael, why don't we start with you?
Well, there was a proposal made very late in the convention by George Mason from Virginia that they add a Bill of Rights. There were a few rights listed in the Constitution. Article 1, Section 9 talks about no bills of attainder and protecting the writ of habeas corpus, except in cases of invasion and rebellion where it can be suspended by Congress. There was a proposal and it was rejected, and it's interesting to think about why. I think to some extent they'd been there for 4 months and they were getting tired and they wanted to go home. But it also sheds light on the fact that they didn't think a Bill of Rights was very important. And Madison, it turned out that was their big strategic mistake. During the ratifying contest, that was the #1 objection to the Constitution made by the opponents, the anti-federalists, was there should be a Bill of Rights. And the response as to why there was no Bill of Rights was, well, it's dangerous, it's useless, it's superfluous. And they meant by that the following. So if you listed a bunch of rights, you would inevitably leave something off the list that you thought was important, and then there would be a strong implication that that thing wasn't protected. So they raised the example of you're not going to put into the Bill of Rights the right to wear a hat, but of course the government shouldn't be telling you whether you can wear a hat or not. So they were worried that if you put down a list of rights, you'd leave something off of it. Madison was also, as Jeff said, he thought they would be a parchment barrier. So you can list all the beautiful rights in the world, but if in a moment of emergency, a moment of war, a moment when the country is approaching disaster, people are not going to respect those rights. They're going to do whatever they think is necessary to protect their society. So Madison said in his letters, you could have a protection for the writ of habeas corpus, but if the country's being invaded, it's not going to matter what you said on a piece of paper. So then, after the Constitution was in place, in the first Congress, Madison was pretty much single-handedly responsible for the Bill of Rights. He had promised in his battle for the congressional seat with James Monroe that he would support a Bill of Rights, and he cared about keeping his word to his constituents. Many of his Federalists said, we don't need a Bill of Rights. We just set up a federal government. Why are you going to disable it with a Bill of Rights? Why are you going to amend it when you have no experience dealing with it? The European bankers who are lending us money are not going to be reassured by the fact that we're tinkering with the Constitution as soon as we just established it. And Madison said, look, we promised our constituents we're going to give them a Bill of Rights. It would be bad to start off on the wrong foot by breaking our promises. And many of these people are acting in good faith. They have genuine concerns the national government will be oppressive. And by the way, North Carolina and Rhode Island haven't ratified yet, and maybe we could get them to ratify if we actually gave them the Bill of Rights. And many of his Federalist Federalist colleagues in Congress said, okay, you made your speech, now sit down and let us do important things like raising revenue and setting up a court system. But Madison wouldn't give up. And I think it's very plausible that without Madison in the first House, there would not have been a Bill of Rights.
Mary Bilder, where do our rights come from?
Yeah, historians differ completely on this. And if you look at the things that we call rights, you can see they come from, some are obviously Magna Carta rights. In 1774, Congress had actually passed a Declaration of Rights, and so some are taken out of that. Some are rights of the fights in the 1760s. Some are rights that are really, I think, uniquely American in this moment, and I'll just give the one that I care a lot about, which is at a time when religious tests are completely common. Not being able to participate in government because of your religious faith is the #1 reason that people, other than property, are not allowed to participate. And the federal Constitution is like basically unique, more or less, in this moment at not just saying that there will be no tests for religious office. That doesn't mean like a citizenship test. That means that you don't have to say a faith-based principle. And then they actually add that you don't have to even take an oath. You can affirm. And so I'm a person who's affirmed my whole life. I think that's a really important aspect of the constitutional promise that we are a pluralistic country of faith. And a letter that I care a lot about, and this is something I've done a lot of work on, how people outside the Constitutional Convention are important. Jonas Phillips, who was a leader in the Jewish community in Philadelphia, and who had actually complained repeatedly about the fact that the Pennsylvania Constitution did not allow him to participate in politics as an elected official. He writes to the convention in September that he hopes that the federal convention will set up a government where people like him can participate. And there's people who dispute was it influential or not. But he didn't just wake up on September 7th and say like, oh wait, I would love to write this letter. He obviously had been talking to people ahead of time. And it is the one private letter that Washington kept that was sent to the convention was the letter of Jonas Phillips insisting on that. And so that's one of the rights in the Constitution. It's not in the Bill of Rights, it's in the structure of the Constitution itself. And I think that some of those rights come from individual people's experience with how important rights have become.
I have another question on this, but I've got more to get to. So I want to talk about checks and balances and separation of powers. Maybe we need to talk about those differently, but let's try to cover them quickly. I thought maybe that would be some of the things you talked about in terms of what was experimental about the Great Experiment. We'd get into a little more of the nuts and bolts of how the government was supposed to work. So what are checks and balances, Jeff?
Checks and balances are horizontal, and they ensure that the three branches of the government can ensure that ambition can counteract ambition, as Madison said in Federalist 55, and that all the branches stay within their lanes. So if the president tries to encroach on the powers of Congress, or the judiciary on the powers of Congress of the president, then all can check the other. It's not a total separation of powers. There was an amendment originally proposed by Madison that would have prohibited each of the branches from exercising the powers of the other, a kind of libertarian extreme amendment. But that fails because the framers want to blend powers in the course of casting them about each other. Hamilton has this phrase, the counteracting passions. And just as they think that you have to use reason to counteract unreasonable passions in your mind, so in the government, ambition and avarice, which are the main illicit passions that they're trying to check, can clash against each other and ensure that a president won't install himself indefinitely in office because he'll want to have a good reputation and won't want to be seen as a demagogue and so forth. So that's the horizontal checks, but then there are also vertical checks, and those are the checks of federalism, and the barriers between state and national power are distributed with each according to its lane, and Madison says in Federalist 39 that there's a kind of dual sovereignty where each is sovereign in its own capacity. What's so interesting is that Madison and Jefferson on the one hand and Hamilton completely agreed about the separation of powers. And when Jefferson gets the Constitution, he writes to Madison, there's stuff I like and stuff I don't like. What I really like is the separation of powers, which he'd seen in Virginia and thought was crucial, and that's also crucial for Hamilton. So they're united on that. What they disagree, of course, about is the nature of federalism. Who should be primarily sovereign, the national government, as Hamilton says, or the states, as Jefferson says. I just have to share one other wild passage from this letter that obviously struck me the other day. Jefferson's writing to Madison, what I'm most afraid of is that there's no term limits for the president, because I am concerned that in the distant future, an unscrupulous demagogic president might lose a presidential election by a few votes, cry foul, refuse to leave office, enlist the states that had supported him on his behalf, and install himself as a permanent dictator. So he's concerned about the minority sore loser demagogue president, and he thinks only a one-year term limit will prevent a president from trying to seek re-election and then losing and installing himself. Hamilton is also afraid of demagogues, but he's afraid of majority demagogues, and he's afraid of the unscrupulous person, unscrupulous in character, who will come in and flatter the crowd and sow the whirlwind. The traditional Caesar-like demagogue who will kind of convert his power totally. So that, just to bring this home, that's the point of the separation of powers. It's urgently important to avoid demagogues, whether it's a minority or a majority, that you ensure that the president is constrained, that he can be checked by Congress, that the judiciary can play its part as well. And then for further security, you have the vertical separation, just this overwhelming concern with concentrated power.
Michael Klarman, did the checks and balances work? Was one branch overpowerful? I mean, what is your thoughts on the first 30-odd years of the Constitution?
The framers would obviously be surprised, shocked by a lot of the changes that have taken place over time, but they're changed circumstances. So it's not even clear that they generally envisioned judicial review. They certainly didn't envision a Supreme Court with the sort of power to make social political policy on abortion, the death penalty, affirmative action, campaign finance reform. Many of the people in Philadelphia they had no experience with judicial review. In Great Britain, in the 18th century, Parliament was sovereign. A couple of state courts had struck down state laws in the mid-1780s, but the state legislatures had been furious, and they literally called the judges to the state legislature to account for their temerity in thinking they had the power to strike down laws. So some of the framers thought courts might strike down laws, some of them thought that they shouldn't, and that none of them envisioned what we have today. Same thing about the imperial executive, the imperial presidency that Arthur Schlesinger Jr. wrote about. They would not have imagined a president who could get the United States into war. They wrote in the Constitution only Congress can declare war, but in the last 70 years, it's usually presidents who decide whether the country goes to war. They would not imagine a president who was the main instigator of national domestic policy, a president who could make immigration policy or environmental policy. They would be shocked by that, but there are various changes in the world that explain why those things happened. And the same thing's true just about the scope of national government power. They would never have dreamed of a Congress being able to regulate wages and hours and local conditions, federal drug safety laws, environmental regulations. They were dealing with a world where the federal government mostly maybe did a little bit of regulation of foreign trade, maybe did a little regulation of domestic interstate trade, but they just were not envisioning anything like that. So they'd be surprised by that, but they wouldn't necessarily criticize it because they realized that they were designing a constitution to last a long time, and it might need some play in the joints in order to work in a different set of circumstances.
Thank you. Tammy Minerio asked, are there feminine sensibilities or contributions that we can point to in constitutional principles and ideas? Now, I'm going to ask this to Mary Bilder, not just because she's a woman, but she's written on this subject. So Mary Bilder, will you please take that one?
Yeah, I want to say thank you. So now I can plug my book, Female Genius. So Doug's right, it's not just because I'm a woman on the panel. So I have argued, and I really believe this, that the period in the 1770s and 1780s is a moment when people have not yet realized that one of the things that written constitutions can do is they can be a very powerful way to exclude people. Because once you put voter exclusions or types of exclusions into constitutions, they're very sticky and hard to change. And so that in the 1770s and 1780s, a number of women across the Atlantic, on both sides of the Atlantic, imagine that in this moment where people are thinking about how people can be better represented, they'll be able to participate. And you turn out to be able to find all sorts of examples of that. There's women who joined parliamentary debating societies in the 1770s and 1780s in London. And I've written about one woman, the first female public lecturer in the United States, Eliza Harriet O'Connor, who in the spring and summer of 1787 was in Philadelphia giving lectures. And George Washington attends her lecture, and it's in his diary while he's waiting for the convention to start that I first met her. And she also wants to have a very powerful school for women, and she believes very much like a number of women and also people of color that what excludes you from political participation, because there are not yet strict rules excluding you, is one, money, but the world is moving towards a market economy, so that suggests people will be able to get more money to vote. And then secondly, education, that there's some capacity piece you need to prove, but there's nothing written down. And so she's part of a whole generation of people who are women and people of color who want to participate. They want to have the rules to allow them to participate, but they believe that part of that is being allowed to be educated. And they are big proponents of schools and education. That gets closed down. The government moves to fund male universities, male colleges, and beginning in 1792 and then moving outward, begins to define a constitutional culture that will eventually be white male, and very explicitly white male. And you can track that as the country increasingly puts into state constitutions those words white male. The best example of this, and Jeff has a great exhibit on this in Philadelphia, is that in New Jersey in this period, women and people of color vote. And they vote throughout this period. They vote in enough numbers that people complain that their candidates aren't winning because women and people of color are voting. And then in the early 19th century, New Jersey reverses that idea and moves to a white male constitution. And so the Constitution is written gender neutral in a moment when that is possible. And that turns out not to be possible. It reminds us history runs backwards in all sorts of ways.
Wonderful. So here's the lightning round. We're down to our last few minutes. We have this very serious clock that's clicking down.
It's like if you argue at the Supreme Court, I think they have that, and then they have a big red light.
Exactly. So you all can't see the clock, but we do. So Michael, I'll start with you quickly. If you had an eraser, then you could go back and change the document when nobody was looking. What would you fix on the Constitution for right now?
I think direct election of the presidency rather than the Electoral College, and a Senate apportioned according to population rather than equally according to states.
Mary Bilder.
You mean the original Constitution?
Whatever you want. It's a fantasy.
Yeah. I agree with.
Not the Electoral College. We've heard that yesterday, today.
I don't get the
Something
Electoral
else.
College.
Yeah.
I don't get. Let Jeff go while I think about this.
Jeff,
Well,
are you allowed to say
No,
that?
the Constitution Center is unconstitutional for me to erase any provisions,
I thought so.
and I'm not allowed to favor one over the other. But long ago, when I was a law teacher, I said that the provision that gave the states control over drawing election districts was a really bad idea, and it led to all the gerrymandering and political problems, and that should be in the hands of Congress instead.
I know what I'd like. Originally, Madison wanted the changes to the Constitution to be integrated into the Constitution. This is how many state constitutions are, and Roger Sherman wins that fight. It's actually a pretty tight fight, and so amendments are tacked on, and that has always produced this sort of since then, this notion like the original Constitution is somehow sacred and represents some moment that cannot be changed unless we read it with these amendments and there's a debate. And Roger Sherman, they actually said, like, how confusing can it be? And I was like, all of con law is based on the confusion. But I wish we integrated the way that the state constitutions did. I think it would make the entire text remind us that the text says we the people, and it's supposed to work for the current moment. And I think if Madison had won that fight, we would have a very different type of constitutional culture.
That's fascinating. Now, before you cheer for them, I do want, and we're going to have this great transition where Jeff is going to move into this chair. But as part of that transition, I want Jeff to tell us his little story. He did an experiment in the Constitution Center where you had a constitutional convention with all kinds of scholars, progressives, conservatives, and whatever we call the people in the middle, normal people maybe. And they had to, and each group had to design different constitutions. Talk a little bit about that and what the results were.
This just blew our minds. So we have three serious teams of people who disagree: conservative, libertarian, and progressive. And we asked them to go into a state of nature, a state of Zoom, and draft their own constitutions. And we were surprised that a bunch of them came up with similar amendments, including conservatives and progressives agreeing to reconsider the Electoral College. So we brought them back for a virtual convention, again on Zoom, and in the space of a week, they came up with 5 amendments to the Constitution. And it blew my mind. I was listening to this and I felt like I was listening to modern day framers. These are some of America's great scholars, and they were deliberating thoughtfully and seriously and parsing every word. And in just a couple sessions, they came up with the following amendments. Eliminate the natural born citizenship requirement. Make impeachment a little harder in the House to indict, but easier to convict in the Senate. Make amendment a little bit easier. Term limits for Supreme Court justices, 18-year term limits, and finally resurrect the legislative veto, which Congress had before the Supreme Court struck it down, and allows Congress to repudiate executive action by majority vote. What's significant about this, first of all, is there are not a lot of rights provisions about stuff people disagree with. They're mostly structural. But isn't that heartening and significant in this polarized time that we are so divided over policy, but there's this core agreement, both about the vitality of the Constitution. None of the teams wanted to throw it out, but they just wanted to refine it and preserve it, and they were actually able to agree on ways of doing that. It gives me hope.
Well, that gives me hope too. Let's give them a big round of applause. Thank you. Thank you so much, Jeff.